And that's just one of 50 libraries in Dade County.
Yeah.
But don't ever say you're bored and you don't know what to do.
Right.
We're very pleased today to have Karen Dustman with us. Karen has written a wonderful book about the big hurricane. Remember back before they gave them names? And it was just the year. So 26, 35, 48, that's how you knew. And this is, I think, a timely topic because next year in September is going to be the 100th anniversary of this hurricane. I think we'll be hearing a lot more about it, remembering it. Now, of course, there's just that tiny group of people like us who remember and care, who actually had friends and relatives who lived here then, you know, because most people aren't from here, right? So it's going to be really wonderful to relive the drama and the trauma and remember exactly what happened. Alan Cromwell very graciously brought a bunch of original newspaper pages from that era, so before you leave the room, check that stuff out. And I don't know how he does it. How do you do it, Alan? You know, how do you find this stuff from people's garage and, you know, that would have got thrown away? And it's absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for that. So today, it's Hurricane Day, and it was almost a hurricane outside, wasn't it? So, but it sort of quit. Has anybody had enough rain this summer?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Just enough? Just barely? Or way too much? Yeah.
Way too much.
Way too much. Okay, so without further ado, Karen, if you're ready. Karen Dustman.
How I do the clicker, is there an advancer or?
Yeah, it's a little
Yeah.
clicker.
Yeah.
Double check it for us.
Okay, which is what?
Down, next slide.
Does it go down, should it go up? There's up. Can you turn off the overhead lights?
Yeah, I'll do that now.
Let me turn those. Not going.
If anything, you just wanna.
I can just do that. I can just do that. That's all right. And the overhead lights. Okay, tell me if you can't hear me. I have one of those little voices, so tell me if I need to speak up, but thank you for dimming the lights a little bit, that's great. So my name is Karen Dustman. I'm a writer, I'm a historian, and I am a recovering lawyer, so please don't hate me. And while I'm not a Miamian by birth, I feel like I really should have been. My dad was born in what's now North Miami in 1916. And as a family, we made several pilgrimages here to Miami when I was a kid. I went to college in St. Pete, and I absolutely love Florida. But Miami in particular has kept calling me back. Over the years, I made several trips here specifically to research this book, which just came out last spring. So I'm very excited to share with you what I learned, not only about this incredible historic hurricane, but also about the history of Miami itself. So I'm inviting you to step back in time exactly 100 years ago to the Miami of 1925, just before the Great Hurricane hit. Cigar-smoking Calvin Coolidge was our president then. He had been sworn into office that previous January for his own term as president after winning the election the previous November. But he had actually been our sitting president since 1923, having taken over after Warren Harding died suddenly in office during a cross-country tour of either a heart attack or a stroke. By 1925, World War I thankfully was over, and this was the height of the Roaring '20s. Just like today, the tourists were flocking to Miami's beautiful beaches. They would buy colorful accordion-style postcard souvenir folders like this one to send home to their friends to brag or just to keep as souvenirs and mementos of their vacation. There was jazz music, there were flappers, and there was still prohibition, although it was growing increasingly unpopular as the law's unintended consequences became more evident. Despite prohibition, underground speakeasies were everywhere, including Miami, and organized crime was thriving on all that bootleg liquor. Al Capone hadn't made it to Miami yet, but organized crime was already here. Miami's proximity to the Bahamas and Cuba made the city a strategic hub for rum running, and at least according to my own family lore, my grandfather was involved in some quiet beachfront deliveries from Bimini. And of course, in 1925, real estate in Miami was booming. As early as 1880, a writer who visited Florida had been cautioning tourists about the state's land sharks. One or more of these species, even back then, infested almost every locality. These, he told readers, could be identified by their hyperbole, describing their property as the greatest bargain to be had in the state, for example, or suggesting an asking price about twice as much as the property was actually worth. That comment was made in 1880, and in 1925's Miami, it was still pretty much true. You'll remember, of course, that Miami itself had been just 300 souls or so back in 1896 when the first tourist train had arrived. By 1920, the city's population had burgeoned from 300 to 30,000. And 5 years later, in 1925, it almost had doubled again to 50,000.
Wow.
There was plenty to see and do in town, not just the beaches, but polo, golf, horseshoe tournaments. There were gondoliers who pulled Venetian-style craft on the waters of Biscayne Bay. In 1920, they had had 75 hotels and about 200 winter rental apartment houses. In 1925, they saw another 481 hotels and apartments added to those numbers. For the tourists, there was horse racing, dog racing, there were casinos that were operated as social clubs, although gambling technically was still illegal at the time. And real estate was booming. This baby elephant, shown here taking his daily plunge in the ocean, was probably a publicity shot for developer Carl Fisher. Another realty company, as you see above, even had its own aircraft and pilot to entice potential buyers, presumably flying them over the burgeoning city to show them where their new home site could be. Property sales were so hot in the mid-20s that a whole new species of land shark had emerged, known as binder boys. These were folks who carried around clipboards and would buy and flip contracts to purchase a property as many as 8 times in a single day, with a small markup in the price each and every time. Miami was happily embracing its astronomical growth. The Miami Herald wrote humorously that crowds had gotten so thick on Miami's downtown streets, pretty soon they would need to build double-decker sidewalks. The cornerstone of a new 27-story courthouse was laid in July of 25, a $3.5 million project. So growth was happening, and it was happening fast. Looking back, we can say it was fueled by speculation, easy credit, aggressive marketing, and unrealistic expectations. But at the time, many folks felt that the growth in Miami was natural and that it was only going to continue. As evidence of that confidence, a record $15.8 million in building permits were issued that October alone of 1925. Even though a market downturn would hit that November, large-scale developments were continuing. In January of 1926, for example, Coral Gables took out a full-page newspaper ad announcing the opening of a new Biscayne Bay section of Coral Gables, touting it as the Miami Riviera. Against this exciting backdrop, a little boy was growing up, and that's my dad on the left, about age 8. He had been born in 1916 at Arch Creek, a tiny settlement that's now part of North Miami, known for its arch, a natural limestone bridge. My dad's grandfather was Bartholomew de Winkler, a native of Belgium, who'd arrived in Florida sometime about 1900 and had taken up acreage just east of the FEC Railroad Depot at Arch Creek. Bartholomew had been a farmer before he immigrated, and here at Arch Creek he must have been excited by the growing conditions. He homesteaded a 13-acre parcel and planted a small citrus grove. And when a post office was established at Arch Creek in 1903, Bartholomew served as the first postmaster, probably with an office near the train depot near his house. My dad grew up in a 2-story house, shown below, which his father, a carpenter, had built on the de Winkler property after marrying one of the de Winkler offspring. But about 1920 or 21, my dad's father abandoned his wife Louise and their 6 children, including my dad, who was about 5 years old at the time. The house they lived in was still not quite finished. There was no stucco on the outside or drywall inside. But Dad, his siblings, and his mom continued to live in the house. My dad's grandfather, Bartholomew, had already passed away in 1908, so Dad's grandmother, that would be Bartholomew's wife, also lived with them. Louise, his mother, made ends meet as best she could with 6 kids to raise. She packed tomatoes at a local tomato packing shed. She sold lunches to the construction workers. She took in boarders. She worked as a janitor at the local school and later worked in a dress factory. And she raised all 6 of her children, as my dad said, with love and kindness.
Wow. That was a tough ride to home.
All through the boom years of the 20s, weather really hadn't been much of a significant concern. A hurricane had struck Florida way back in 1910, but that one swept ashore on the west coast at Cape Coral and then marched up the center of the state. It had left some damage, including salting a good bit of farmland near the coast, but by and large, Miami was unscathed. And for Miami visitors like these, shown in 1925, 1910 seemed like a lifetime ago. The tail end of yet another hurricane did sweep Miami in late July of 26. That brought high winds, and there was some flooding on Collins Avenue at North Beach. But the Bahamas took the brunt of it, and they did get hit pretty hard. But the damage at Miami was pretty slight, and residents basically just shrugged it off. Visitors continued sending happy snapshots and postcards like this one home, telling everyone what a great time they were having. The attraction wasn't just the sun and the sand. Miami was the happening place. The city was booming, and it was exciting just to be in the middle of all that growth. As one tourist wrote home on a brightly colored postcard folder, sure is a lot of wealth in Miami. And so in September of 1926, nobody was really expecting a serious hurricane. The National Weather Service did eventually take notice that not 1 but 3 tropical storms were gathering force out in the Caribbean. And on September 17th, they put out an official tropical storm warning for Miami. The afternoon newspapers dutifully published the storm warning, and telephone and telegraph exchanges were notified. But you remember there had just been a hurricane in July that had turned out to be nothing. So even people who saw those storm warnings tended to shrug and go on about their business. And many, many more Miami residents, including my dad and his family, knew nothing at all about the approaching storm. There were, however, subtle warnings. One newspaperman named Joe Reese, who wrote about it afterwards, would say there was a strange heaviness in the air, akin to suffocation. My dad also remembered feeling that the air was funny, as if something was wrong. Late on the evening of September 17th, the barometer began to drop as the storm approached, and high winds soon followed. At 11:30 p.m., the official red and black hurricane warning flags were hoisted from the 3-story federal building downtown, but by then it was far too late. Most of Miami's residents were asleep. And already the winds were very strong. Meteorologist Richard Gray would later say when he went out to raise that signal flag, the wind knocked him off his feet and, quote, let him down none too gently. About 3 the next morning, the skies opened up and it began to pour down rain. Phone service was knocked out all over town as telephone poles were blown down, and the lights went out for everyone. The sheer noise of the wind, breaking glass, and crashing building materials tended to wake up residents, but they found themselves shrouded in inky darkness. And if they were lucky, they had put away candles, matches, or lanterns, but they had to try to find them in the dark. The heavy rain eased a bit as dawn approached, but by 5:30, the heavy rain returned, and one witness likened it to the flow from a fire hose. About 20 minutes after the heaviest rain arrived, Richard Gray, the meteorologist, was forced to recalibrate his barometric instrument when the pen dipped completely off the bottom of his chart. His adjusted barometer reading would show a pressure of 27.64 millibars, the lowest ever recorded at the time in the history of the U.S. Weather Bureau, according to Miami Daily News. Sunrise would not arrive until 7:07 a.m. One of the most amazing things about this particular storm was that personal photography was a relatively recent phenomenon. Kodak had introduced its Brownie camera about 1900, and by 1926, many families had their own personal cameras. As soon as daylight finally came, people went outside and began snapping pictures like these, even while the storm still was raging. The image on the left was taken by a tourist who had booked a room at the Pancoast Hotel on Miami Beach. His notes on the back of the photo reported that this image was captured from his third-floor balcony. At right is a photo also taken at Miami Beach showing the palm trees in Loomis Park bending with the force of the wind, and the Casa Loma apartments are in the background. About 6:15 a.m., with sunrise still nearly an hour away, the eye of the hurricane arrived, and suddenly all the noise stopped. The winds dropped to almost nothing. The crashing and howling came to a halt. But the calm was deceptive, and it was deadly. People didn't realize this was just the eye of the storm. They thought their terrible experience was over. Some people climbed in their cars to try to find loved ones or simply to go out and view the damage. Curiosity seekers even went down to the beach to see the big waves, or perhaps to try to find what might have washed up. And for many, that would prove to be a fatal mistake. Author Joe Reese wrote later, most of those who perished met their fate when they went out during the lull between 6 and 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. The streets were filled with people curious to view the wreckage. The young woman in the center of the photo atop may have been one of those who had ventured out. We don't know the story behind the photograph, but it looks to me like she had tried to go somewhere in her car. This photo shows her being rescued by two men as they battle the wind. The picture was snapped on Bayshore Drive just outside the Miami News building, possibly by one of the newspaper's photographers. And below is what Flagler Street looked like in the downtown business district while the storm clouds were still overhead with water and debris clogging the street. So what did people go through during those long hours from about midnight until 2 the next afternoon while the storm was raging? Written accounts left by many survivors are both amazing and horrifying. Here's how my dad described what he experienced at age 10. He said, "Mother stood us first in the fireplace of our home for protection. But when the water reached the first landing of our stairs, she realized we had to leave. She moved us first to stand us by the wall of a big brick warehouse, a big brick wall, which was walking distance from our house. Then maybe she decided that wasn't exactly safe, and we moved to a hotel apartment building that was still under construction. And we stayed there a long time." And when he said by a long time, I think he probably meant several weeks, along with other families who had been evacuated. Later, when we went back, we saw that same big wall where we had been standing had fallen down. We could have been under it. Other firsthand accounts were even more frightening. Here's one from Dr. George Woolard, who had just moved into a new 2-room apartment adjoining his medical office in a swanky building in Coral Gables, opposite the Roney Plaza, overlooking the ocean. And this is an artificial intelligence, an AI photo. It's not a real thing, but I thought it was a great illustration. About 10 o'clock, the wind was getting pretty high, and I went out and turned my big twin 6 Packard coupe around, backing it against the wind, putting it in reverse and setting the emergency brake as tightly as possible. The wind at this time was so strong, the sand cut into one space like needles. I went back inside and lay down, but with my clothes on. I noticed that the ocean was rising rapidly and the water already was coming in under the doors. It was only a short time before I noticed the rugs were being lifted, and putting my hand down, I felt the water to be about 12 inches deep. I decided, therefore, to change into my bathing suit. This must have been about midnight. About this time, the lights went out, and finding matches, I lit a candle in one of the wrought iron candelabra. The water was still gradually rising, and I could hear huge waves swishing in the outer office. All of a sudden, I heard an awful crash. The front doors had given way, and huge waves were coming in, carrying out my furniture on their return. Foolishly, I rushed over and tried to close them. It was all I could do to retain an upright position, even by holding onto the walls. Then the remaining windows and doors crashed in at intervals until all were gone on the ocean side. I was just about to return to my private office when two great waves swept in, one from the ocean side, the other from 23rd Street, and a big bundle rolled up at my feet. This big bundle turned out to be a policeman who had been on duty outside the Roni Plaza Hotel. He told me a huge wave had picked him up and deposited him right at my feet.
Wow.
We made our way back to the lounge where the northern window was still intact, and we sat in armchairs for a while. Then the one remaining window crashed in, and I could feel the floor trembling. The water rose so high that the chairs on which we were sitting were floating. When I felt the floor quiver, I grabbed the policeman's wrist and bellowed at him to follow me. Through the window opening, we could see huge coconut palm trees going by uprooted, as well as the roofs which had blown off of houses. It must have been divine providence that directed me to the only room, the door of which still held. I pulled the huge pecky cedar door closed behind us to prevent the waves from coming in. As the water by then was up to our waists, we had to climb up on the table, where we sat until it rose so high that we had to stand. Minutes now seemed hours, and though we scarce spoke a word, the knowledge that we weren't absolutely alone was some comfort to us. By then, the sand and debris had built up to about 2.5 feet deep, so we were unable to open a door to get out. The water continued to rise rapidly about dawn. We had been forced to stand on the table and hang onto the chandelier, and from this point the water rose steadily until it was at our chins, with our heads touching the ceiling, and we could go no higher. Outside, roofs were still going by on the wind, and debris was racing by the windows at a terrific rate. I stepped off the table and swam under a door transom to a small closet, and on coming to the top was overjoyed to see that the window there had not been blocked by the debris. I swam back and so reported to the policeman, and he handed me his revolver. I then swam back again until I reached the closet's windowsill, and after trying unsuccessfully twice, I finally managed to smash the window with the revolver, and I stepped out gingerly. I had, however, barely got my right leg and arm through before I was picked up as though I had been nothing and thrown bodily back into the pile of debris. Clinging to the balcony above me, I made my way hand over hand to the windows of the salon. The wind made it difficult for me to retain my hold, finally tearing me loose altogether and hurling me through the windows. Swimming and crawling, I made my way to the mantel where I rested. The tide now was receding, and the waters in the office were going with it very fast. I swam and walked to the door of the room where the policeman was still being held a prisoner, and using a frying pan that I found in the debris, gradually dug him out. At noon on Saturday, we were rescued, having been in the water for over 10 hours. I had nothing but a bathing suit on, and even this was partly torn off. Dr. Woolard didn't stop to rest, though. He was a medical doctor, and he immediately threw himself into relief work wearing a borrowed suit. He would later discover that he himself had broken 6 ribs during his narrow escape.
Wow.
And his harrowing account is just one of many of the survivors who did survive. As the wind finally died down mid-afternoon, people began emerging from their homes and shelters, and they began to take pictures. This is one of my favorite images from the immediate aftermath of the storm. Men, including at least 2 police officers, are surveying the flooded street outside the Miami police station. As you can see, several of them have rolled up their pants legs, but the man in the center simply donned a bathing suit as the most logical clothing choice in the wake of the storm. As Dr. Woolard's story showed, this wasn't the only one. Some hurricane victims reportedly even showed up for work the next week, still clad in their bathing suits.
Where was the Miami Beach police station in those days?
I'm sorry, the police station?
Yeah, where was it?
Oh, I don't know for sure.
Forget it.
Don't know for sure. These 2 images, too, are some of my favorites. Both were amateur snapshots captured by anonymous survivors. At top, a pair of men stand on a sidewalk surveying the still flooded street. And at bottom, the water still stands several inches deep inside a flooded lunchroom, a haunting image that might have been taken by the business owner. Roofs were blown off houses, and homes like this one were knocked completely off their foundation. Many homes were lost completely. This man at Hollywood was combing the wreckage of his house for anything he could salvage. As you can see at right, there's a chair and other possessions that he has managed to save. And images like these give you a visual idea of the incredible force of the wind, which had reached at least 130 miles an hour, some said even more. Heavy automobiles had been tossed around like matchbox toys. Huge piles of sand and debris were also left behind by the receding waves, not only outside the buildings, like this view near the Roni Plaza at Collins Avenue and 23rd Street, but also inside the buildings. Exactly how many homes were damaged in the storm? It's really hard to know for sure. I've seen estimates ranging from 2,000 to 20,000 homes. An estimated 50,000 people like these were left homeless. And amazingly, these folks were still able to smile for the camera. People did the best they could to salvage what they could. In the photo at the top, for example, it appears this homeless family was trying to dry out a few articles of clothing. The utilities were out for several days. Many folks wound up using fairly primitive methods to cook, a condition which led to some unfortunate fires. For a time, there was no water to cook or to flush toilets with. Even once service was finally restored, residents were firmly urged to boil water before drinking it. But the loss of homes and possessions, of course, paled in comparison to the loss of life. Roughly 500 lives came to a sudden, abrupt end in that one September day. The exact total of the dead was impossible to determine because some bodies were swept out to shore, out to sea, and never found. The official totals reported included 113 dead in Miami, 54 in Hollywood, 22 in Hialeah, 10 in Fort Lauderdale, and 11 in Dania. Here, men are shown burying some of the dead at Moorhaven. And this was the hardest hit area of all, as floodwaters from Lake Okeechobee claimed over 150 lives out of a town of just 1,200 people. In addition to all of the deaths, again about 500 total, another 5,000 people survived, but with injuries, often from the falling debris. Many of them had broken bones, head injuries, and more. Unfortunately, looting after a disaster is not just a recent phenomenon. In the 1926 hurricane, even before the winds had completely stopped, looters emerged and began stealing jewelry, clothes, and other items from damaged stores, especially downtown. The Miami police stepped in quickly to maintain order, and they posted sentries to deter looters, and they imposed a curfew of 6 p.m. As you can imagine, however, law enforcement forces were stretched pretty thin. Martial law was talked about, though never formally declared, but several hundred Marines and National Guardsmen were brought in for a short time to help patrol the streets. And the citizens, too, stepped up. Both the Miami and Miami Beach police would deputize able-bodied men as part of a special police corps to help, including members of the American Legion and the Lions Club. One other very important step was taken by city officials. They ordered retailers and food sellers not to profiteer on the emergency by price gouging, warning sellers that they could be arrested and their whole inventory confiscated if they did. Simply getting information about your loved one after the storm was difficult. Not only was telephone service out for several days, but telegraph wires too were down. Here, a crowd has gathered outside the Miami police station waiting for word about their missing relatives. Undertakers' parlors were filled with bodies, some of them identified, many of them not. The newspapers printed very sad lists of the dead, including names when they had them, and again with some completely unidentified. Some of the very first emergency response efforts were by citizens, even before the Red Cross stepped in. As early as the evening of September 18th, Acting Mayor James H. Gilman hastily convened a Citizens Relief Committee to coordinate disaster response efforts. A variety of civic organizations and businesses stepped up. Here, the American Legion headquarters on Bayshore Boulevard was turned into a temporary hospital, opening its doors to treat the injured even while the storm was still raging. And in the days to follow, the American Legion Hall also became a place for distributing food and supplies to survivors. Hotels, big and small too, opened their doors to provide not only shelter, but also a place for medical care to hurricane survivors. And these included the McAllister Hotel at Miami and the Flamingo at Miami Beach. The Red Cross, too, responded almost immediately and was hugely instrumental in organizing and delivering emergency aid. Within 24 hours after the hurricane struck, an FEC truck carrying the first wave of supplies came through, FEC train. Within a day after the winds had abated, they began setting up temporary hospitals and relief stations. Here, a group of Red Cross and relief volunteers were making sandwiches to feed the survivors. The Red Cross also set up vaccination stations providing free inoculations against typhoid fever and tetanus. City water lines had broken, and officials feared contamination even after water service was restored. The newspapers were urging citizens to boil water before using it for cooking or drinking, and they also urged them strongly to get vaccinated to help prevent an epidemic. The amount of cleanup required was nearly Herculean. Not only were there towering piles of sand, vegetation, and other debris, but if you can imagine, huge boats too had been thrown up on the shore, some as large as a huge freighter. Here's just one large boat, which was deposited by the waves near Royal Palm Park. It looks like there's a crane in the background which is trying to help lift it. And there are smaller pleasure boats littering the park toward the right. And in the background, you can see the Royal Palm Hotel itself. Here are two more views as the cleanup efforts began. At top, you can see a large crane has been brought in to help clear the city streets. And at bottom, there's a tugboat in the center that had run aground, and men are trying to coax it onto a trailer near Burdine's department store, according to the legend on the back. Miami Sheriff ordered all able-bodied men to turn out to assist. There are no idle men, one reporter said proudly. If one is found, he is conscripted to the work of clearing away debris or replanting trees. All told, the property losses across Miami were pegged at over $100 million, and that brought a different kind of crisis. Insurance companies were faced with huge losses, and a flood of insurance adjusters swept into town next. Unfortunately, many homeowners wound up unhappy with the way the companies handled, or didn't handle, their claims. Some people complained that the insurance companies seemed much more eager to write new policies at 50% higher rates than to settle the claims of their existing customers. Some folks were able to hire help to repair their damaged buildings and businesses. The Miami Contractors Association offered to provide their work to destitute homeowners at cost. And volunteer workers, too, helped make hundreds of buildings habitable. One of the most touching stories to me, in blue-collar Alapata, skilled tradesmen turned down job offers that would have paid them top dollar and instead worked for free fixing up the homes of their neighbors. In my father's case, the Red Cross helped to repair the family home enough so that they could finally move back in. But for my dad, the most memorable result of the hurricane was the damage to the family's piano. The piano was a treasured possession for a family that was just scraping by. He always called it a Philpott piano, which I thought was a brand. But no, it simply came from Philpott and Sons Music Store. And I imagine it probably looked something like this. It was the piano that became the measure for him of how high the water had come in their house. Here's how he described it. We were about 3 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, but there was an arm of the bay in between. And with the water surge, there was water all over. The sand and the water came up over the keyboard of our piano, and the mud practically ruined our Philpott piano. It took off all the ivories, so I just continued to play it without them.
There he is.
Yeah. I want you to know that my dad's story has a happy ending. This was him playing with the dog just before the hurricane hit. And he did continue to play that water-damaged piano. By the time he was in high school, so roughly 5 years after the hurricane, he was giving concerts. And he wound up becoming a professional musician, teaching college and performing both here and abroad. This is his debut recital from Town Hall in New York City in 1953. Miami, too, eventually had a happy ending, although it definitely wasn't a soft landing. The tourist industry, as you can imagine, was hard hit by the hurricane. And it didn't help that right after the September 26 hurricane, there was another one that came close in October that same year. That one proved to be a narrow miss for Miami, but it did great damage to Cuba and the Bahamas. Those two hurricanes, plus growing concern over inflated prices, slowed things considerably in 1927. It also didn't help that would-be tourists were concerned about setting foot in Florida at all for a kind of a different reason. They didn't want to set foot within the jurisdiction of a Florida court because they had defaulted on real estate contracts they had signed back when things were booming. One humorous observer said about the only thing that kept the tourist season of 1927 to 28 from being a complete flop was the supply of good whiskey. And then a third hurricane hit South Florida in September of 1928, almost 2 years exactly to the day after the one of 26. This one swept in and made landfall near West Palm Beach, but it was a deadly and destructive one. As historian Seth Bramson has noted, these triple disasters propelled Miami into an early decline. And as he put it, in effect, Miami experienced the Great Depression 3 years earlier than the rest of the country. The once grand hotels, like the Royal Palm below, were no longer practical as visitors' budgets changed. Now, postcards from the 30s began showing a Florida tin can tourist camp with tents for traveling motorists. It was quite a study in contrasts. The lavish Royal Palm Hotel had not been too badly damaged, actually, in the 26 hurricane, but by now it was aging and it was infested with termites. The Flagler Corporation made the painful decision to simply tear it down in June of 1930. The sad amateur photo was captioned, "Last picture of the Royal Palm Hotel before the wreckers started work." Some building in Miami did continue even after these storms and despite the economic challenges, and for a time it almost seemed as if Miami would recover. This wire photo aerial view of Miami was taken in July 1929, and it shows the Miami harbor. The caption was touting the city's skyscrapers, calling the city a little New York. But less than 4 months after this photo was taken, the stock market crashed. But you can't keep a good city down. Beautiful, vibrant Miami would eventually recover from her setbacks. The iconic Art Deco buildings would be built for a new influx of tourists, sometimes even on lots that had been cleared by the hurricane. Ironically enough, it would be yet another catastrophe, the Second World War, that would finally return Miami to prosperity. During the war, manufacturing and training bases for the military helped to boost the local economy, and after the war was over, well, many of those GIs remembered Florida's balmy weather and the sunshine, and they came back, either just to visit or to stay. But the 1926 hurricane left a lasting impact. There were, of course, many more hurricanes that would come later, but among my dad's generation, the one in 26 was always referred to simply as the Great Hurricane, or the Big Blow. Memories of houses like this one blown off their foundation and entire buildings crumbled to dust. The people who saw scenes like these didn't simply forget. As early as February the following year, 1927, newspaper advertisements were touting hurricane-proof construction for model homes in Miami. The fine print at the top of this advertisement is touting the use of southern pine, the supreme structural wood of the world. The reason for this was simple. Many of the older homes built of southern pine had actually survived the recent hurricanes just fine. What people didn't talk about quite so much was that the newer homes also used it, but these quickly thrown up recent houses did suffer mightily in the storm. So it wasn't just the building material that had led these older homes to survive, but rather the strengths of the construction technique used by the builder. Back in the day, many builders simply drove a handful of nails to toenail the roof trusses to the walls. And if they were doing a really great job, they would wrap some wire around them or attach thin strips of metal to join the two building components together. Over time, and with the hindsight that only disasters are able to provide, improved building codes were developed and were refined again and again, and better disaster preparedness went mainstream, like these sturdy metal hurricane straps and clips that are used today. In the end, Miami's sheer tenacity prevailed. She not only endured all that Mother Nature threw her way, but found ways to survive and thrive. New opportunities were seized, New economic drivers were embraced. And there's a reason that the hurricane of September 18, 1926 was known for so long as the Great Hurricane. It was a terrifying, awful, tragic, sometimes miraculous day that marked a turning point in Miami's history and propelled the young city headlong into the Great Depression. My hope in writing this book was to celebrate the lives and the tenacity of everyone who lived through it and to honor the memories of the unfortunate who didn't. I have many more first-person stories and pictures of the storm in the book, and I thank you so much for listening. I'd love to stay in touch. I'd love to answer questions, and I hope people will reach out if you have any else questions that I can answer later.
Do you have any books to share?
Are there any questions? Yes?
Where did you source your photos from?
Oh, good question. Where did I get the photos from? Okay, so right after the hurricane, there were a number of publishers who put out booklets for newspapers carried the story all over the country, of course, and the rest of the country was eager for word of what had happened in this terrible disaster. And so some publishers quickly put out publications with pictures of the storm and descriptions of the statistics and what had happened for consumption, kind of like the National Enquirer sort of stuff. They would sell for between 25 cents and $1, so there was a lot of those that went out. But again, a lot of people also had their own personal cameras back then. So a lot of the pictures that I got were from eBay. So people were clearing out their great-grandmother's or grandmother's stuff. They put them up on eBay. There are still pictures on eBay available today. There's a wonderful collection of photos in the back of the room that are, again, one-off photos, which is really fun from people's collections. Some people were kind enough to annotate the back of their photos and say actually what they were of. Many of them are purely anonymous, but do survive, and so it's just a treasure trove of images. So some of them were from that, they're out of copy right now, and some of them were ones that I purchased on eBay. Yes?
It seems like your father wrote down his memoirs. Is that because you asked him to do it?
Thank you for that question, yeah. So I was fortunate or foresightful enough to ask him to his story before he died, and have tried to collect stories from other people in the family as well. I actually did do a family history book that's collected stories from my dad, his brother, and his sister, so they're all published there with some family stories. One of the things I'm passionate about are family memoirs and family stories, and I really, I've helped collect memoirs for about 25 or 30 people, I guess, just because I think it's important to document that history before it's gone. I actually wrote a book on how to write your family story, how to collect memoirs, that kind of thing. So I would encourage all of you who have stories to please write them down. I gave this talk a little while ago and was so tickled that there was somebody in the audience whose father had also gone through the 1926 hurricane, and he reached out to me by email. I was just so happy to hear about it. And his father had been on a houseboat, actually, and he was one of the few who survived. A lot of people in the boats were the ones who were swept off and died or drowned. And his father had managed to leave the houseboat with his dog on his head or his shoulders. He saved his dog and got to shore successfully, and went on and had a family. And now hopefully I hope his grandson or his son will write down his story so that story is preserved. So, do you have any questions about writing memoirs? Let me know. I'm happy to give advice. Yes.
In high school, my daughter was friends with she's still friends with him, named Alex Adams. And the Adams family owned an old grocery store here in town. There were several of them, one on 24th Street in the highway, one in South Miami. It was like not a Whole Foods, a fresh market, kind of gourmet. They were famous for their spinach. Anyway. It was a very old family. Had been here for generations. And his grandfather used to tell the story that he survived that hurricane by tying himself to a palm tree.
Tying himself to a palm tree. That story is not unique. In other words, people did that. They would tie their wife to a tree. One man tied his wife to a tree or a telephone pole or something and came back and she was dead, but some people did survive. The winds were so strong. If you can imagine 130 mile an hour wind, they would tie themselves to whatever they thought would survive.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing, amazing. Is anybody here who's got family who's lived through the 26 hurricane? All right. I hope you've written your family story down. There you go. Yes, my family.
May I?
Yes.
Did you put anything in there about the Native Americans?
Yes, I did, a little bit. One of the stories that was really interesting to me was for the next, was it the next hurricane? I think it was the 28 one. There was a story in the newspaper. The Native Americans knew before the white folks knew that there was a hurricane coming, and they had started moving to higher ground like weeks ahead of it. So they were aware and watched the natural environment changing. And my traveling partner was telling me that watching the ibis is one way that Native Americans sometimes will know that there's a big storm coming. So yes, yes, yes.
In the photo of the three people, I believe they were standing in front of a fence with clothes drying.
Yes.
It caught my attention that the women were wearing like sleeveless and short sleeve. And back at that time, I would think there was modesty and also covering because of mosquitoes and bugs. And I was kind of surprised, and I'm wondering, had the times changed, or was it because of the heat in Miami? Do you?
The clothing choices, well, by then it was 26, so the modesty wasn't quite the same as like the teens. And I'm sure it was hot, I'm sure it was warm, and I'm sure they had to fight with mosquitoes. In fact, after the hurricane itself, they would have been really worried about mosquito-borne illnesses, typhoid and other things. So I'm sure they had to cope with that.
But in photos that you were seeing from that time, that was not unusual?
That was not unusual. That was not unusual, no.
Interesting.
No. Any other questions? Yes.
Many years ago, I did a lot of photography work for the Bahamas News and Tourism Agency, and they had, I'm sure a lot of people in this room know this, there are a lot of Bahamians that have relocated to Coconut Grove to work as construction, waiters, waitresses, that kind of thing. Is there any anecdotes in your book from some of the citizens in Coconut Grove? Anybody that may have been contributed or may have been working
In Coconut Grove in particular?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
I'm remembering there was a newspaper from Coconut Grove area that's been part of my personal archive that was right after the storm, but other than that, in terms of anecdotes or something from people in Coconut Grove, I don't remember anything in particular. But if you want that reference, I can happy to find you that newspaper.
No, I was just curious.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering, we know this hurricane as the hurricane of 1926. I wonder at what point in time did they start naming them with female names?
That's a good question. I don't know when they started naming them.
1950 was the first time they named them.
Okay, now we know, 1950s, they started naming them?
50.
Yeah, this is always saying what hurricane.
Yeah.
Female names.
Female names,
At some
okay.
point, they figured out it wasn't fair to name them all after women.
Yeah.
Give some equality here.
Or maybe they were running out of names.
Don't want to blame just us, yeah.
That was fascinating.
Thank you.
What a nice crowd. Everybody enjoyed that?
Yes.
You know, I'll remind you, if some people don't know, the Miami Pioneers and the natives of Dade, if we go back to the beginning of the Miami Pioneers, they started in 1936 because a lot of prominent people that started and built Miami out of nothing, they were all dying off. And so the people that were left said, you know, it's only right that we start a historical organization to honor these early people. And originally, to be a member of the Miami Pioneers, your family had to be here before 1900. And then they got everybody they could, and then later on in the 40s, they said, all right, well, anybody that was here before the hurricane. And you knew what that meant, the hurricane. And so eventually the Miami Pioneers allowed everybody to be a legacy member whose family came before 1926, before September of the hurricane. So it does have a special part of our history. The before and after this hurricane is very much of a line there. And the people who came before, they enjoyed a wonderful era there. I mean, at first it was very, very difficult living here, the mosquitoes and you know, just getting around was next to impossible. Of course, but the guy that sold you the land, he promised it was going to be great.
Yeah.
And I remember a statistic in 1910, 2/3 of every family that moved down here turned around and left.
Wow.
So there was a lot of hucksterism. There was a lot of land sharks. There was a lot of people promising everything, and then you got, like I say, mosquitoes, no roads, no infrastructure. There was no easy way. You had to grow your own food. Everything was agricultural, you know? And it really wasn't until that boom between 1915 and 1925 that it really took on what looked like a real city, a real community. And all these disparate little neighborhoods, like for example, Arch Creek, which we now know as North Miami. I don't know why they couldn't have just left at Arch Creek, do you? I mean, come on. Arch Creek sounds like a lovely place to live.
North Miami is another.
And some of us are members of the Arch Creek Trust, and we do endeavor to keep that place alive. The Arch Creek property itself was set to become a Dodge dealership, and they were just gonna wipe out the whole thing and make a parking lot.
When was that?
1972, it was saved. So this was going on from 1968 and further, and it was one of the first good examples of where a group of determined people in the community went to the state, went to Tallahassee, and fought for preservation. And ironically, they got it, and the day that they came home and said, we got it, the arch crashed and fell in. And that's life for you, right?
Yeah.
Now, some people said it was dynamite and whatnot, but the train was running 40 feet from it. And the big
Vibration.
gravel trains were rumbling the whole neighborhood, and that's probably what did it. But we know stories from Arch Creek all the way back to early archaeological finds that was a place where people met, indigenous people, in whatever language they said, meet at the arch, and everybody knew what that meant. So it really was an iconic place, and that was just one neighborhood. And Miami was full of these neighborhoods. Now we think of it all as one big place, don't we? But Lemon City and Buena Vista and Alta Vista and all the Fulford, Otis, you know, Opelika. Yeah, Opelika was newer. You know, that was, Hialeah was a new place, you know.
Well, I don't know, that's 100 years this year for all of them.
Yeah, and we are looking at, in many cases, the 100-year anniversary of a lot of cities. We just had Coral Gables, we have North Miami and North Miami Beach. We're both having their 100th anniversary, and so many of that grand era. And this hurricane was a defining line. After that, the great boom and the unbridled enthusiasm and the craziness, really, reality caught up. And so this will always be one of our greatest, you know, historical timelines here is this hurricane. Thank you so much. The way you related those stories, it was wonderful. Thanks.
I brought a little bit of swag, so if anybody wants some postcards or free bookmarks, I've got that. And I'm wondering if anybody was catching there. I just happened to see somebody was on the Zoom and was posting questions. So
Yes.
does anybody know what those questions were, or just kind of?
Mentioning something about someone in their family.
Okay. I would love to hear the family stories of the people who are posting. So if they want to reach out to me, that would be great.
That was Molly Park. I served on the board of Genealogical Society of Greater Miami with her, so I know this story. So her husband, John Park, and family were pioneers in, I think, Miami Springs.
Miami Springs?
She'll probably correct me on text. And so they were here before the hurricane.
I would love to hear that story.
She was making a comment about that. John, her husband, has written a lot about his family, and she's been doing a lot of the genealogical research, and they've been sharing it at the society meetings as well, like in some of the training classes that we have.
Okay, great. Down.
There she is.
Okay, there's me.
Yes, my husband, John Park, is right here.
All right.
Oh, hello. Well, I'm from a pioneer family. My grandmother and grandfather, Bernice and Walter Park, moved down in 1925 into Miami Springs, and they lived on what was the FEC Canal, which was the western border of Miami Springs. And their house was completely destroyed by the hurricane. And then in, I think, the 29 hurricane, they were living in another portion of Miami Springs. And my father, who is the oldest of the sons, stayed in the house. And the water got up to his waist. That would be from it was right on the Okeechobee Canal. And the roof was actually moved about 3 feet, although it wasn't blown completely off. But they had to reposition the roof after the storm.
Oh my goodness. Oh, what great stories. Thank you very much. I heard another funny family story from our family. Some members of our family, the elder members of the family, were telling me about their part of the family, and they were saying that one member of the family had been associated with the engineering firm over on building Miami Beach, and they didn't pay him for his civil engineering work. They paid him a lot in lots of property. They gave him lots in Miami Beach. And after the hurricane, he sold all 10 lots that he owned because nobody's ever going to want to live there anymore. Nobody's going to buy them. Don't we wish we still owned those lots? Oh.
That's wonderful. Now, you're in California, aren't you?
I live in California now.
Yeah. Well, thanks for making the
Thank
trip.
you.
All of that. That was really wonderful. Okay, if anybody's not on the email list, just put your name and your email on there, and we'll continue sending out notes once or 3 times a month and let you know what's going on. Really appreciate having everybody here today. Anybody have anything they want to share with the group? Anything coming up you want to share?
One of the things that people forget is there wasn't as much paved over back in those days, but you can certainly see a difference now because you have the paving over.
Right.
There's nowhere for the water to go. But if you have a water table with a lot of rain, and your water level's right there at the surface, because we do not have a high level here, you have nowhere for the rain to go except up to your necks. So, that's what happens in this area.
Yeah, we certainly have had a lot of rain this summer, haven't we? Goodness. Question, comment?
Maybe, it reminded me of something that happened, how old was I? I don't know, late teens. I lived on Rubble Avenue, and it was a very pretty Spanish house with a 3-foot sunken living room. And it was gorgeous, you know, the tile and all that sort of thing. And then in those years, it seemed being a hurricane every year. My bedroom was maybe 3 steps up, and the 30-foot living room would fill with a minimum, this is then, 5 feet of water. And the one hurricane I really remember is, as I say, my bedroom was 3 steps up, okay, because, okay, so that's up there. All right, I was in this double bed, and obviously I had my bathing suit on. And I'm sleeping because, you know, I go like this, I wake up. I don't know why my mother didn't wake me up, but anyway, I felt the water level with my bed. It hadn't come to my bed yet. Maybe she was waiting for that. No. Anyway, so, and I'm just under 5'8". Okay, so I get up, and it was right here.
Yeah.
I mean, right here. And that, I mean, so, I mean, we were, what, a block and a half from the water, but we always knew the living room would flood.
Yeah,
all right?
yeah.
But, you know, I was going to say, if you haven't already done it, or maybe you've heard, History Miami downtown has, where you tell your stories.
Yeah.
That sort of thing, which every now and then I think I should say something like that, because, you know.
And you don't forget things like that, do you?
Things like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that one was particular.
Water in the bed, there you go. But you know, it's great that so many of these stories have been captured over the years, you know? And what is amazing, I thought, and you touched on it, that some of the original pine homes were built so well that it was later construction that didn't last. I think we all heard or saw what happened out at Country Walk.
Yeah.
That place fell apart. And old homes like our family home in Arch Creek is still there. It was built well. You know, the Burr family home down at the Burrsberry farm was built in 1921, that's survived everything since then. So, yeah, it's amazing that Dade County pine is pretty tough stuff. Kind of even hard to saw through it. You had to, you know, and termites just gave up eventually. So that was part of the legacy of the history here. And, you know, there's so many people who don't seem to care much about local history, but I would say everybody in this room is an exception. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody who kicked in some money this year. We tried a new thing. We sent out invoices like in the computer age. Yeah, it worked. And so thank you for paying your invoice. We appreciate it.